Okay, let's see. Good evening, everyone. It's been a while since I made a video, so I wanted to make a video tonight. I've actually been traveling, and I just got back into town maybe 2 hours ago. So I was on the road a little bit because I was actually down at a function down in Savannah, Georgia. So I was at the CHD, the Children's Health Defense annual conference that was down in Savannah. It's kind of crazy, when I was stationed at Fort Benning. I don't even know what the new name of Fort Benning is now. So sorry for those of you who care about that. I was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I lived in Columbus for 5.5 years. I never once went to Savannah. And I always told myself, like, I got to go to Savannah. I got to go to Savannah. And you're there, you live there, you assume you can go to Savannah whenever you want. And then the next thing you know, you move away and you never went to Savannah. So anyway, 10 years later, after having moved away from Georgia, I finally made it to Savannah, even if it was for a quick weekend. It's a cool area. The conference was great, met some good people, so that was good. But um, and I also got to visit home, my hometown in North Carolina for a couple of days. Went to some CHD bus events that were happening in North Carolina, and just kind of made a trip out of it. Visited my hometown. Um, Went to the North Carolina bus events, and then turned around and went to Savannah the following weekend. So I've been gone for about 10 or 11 days. So I just got back, but I wanted to make a video because it's been a while since I've made one. So I put out a Substack post. I wrote it while I was at my mom's house, and on this trip. So I was in North Carolina, and it was about a concept that I called deep war. So I wanted to talk about that. So what is deep war, and why am I talking about this? So I had this idea. Actually, I had a couple ideas that I was trying to write about for a couple of weeks. And I had this extremely expansive scope of something that I was writing, and I had a couple of large significant themes that I was trying to tie together. So I had what I thought was a common thread that I was trying to use to tie these concepts together. And I was having some difficulty, one, because of the scope of what I was trying to write, but also because some of these themes, they are admittedly nebulous, or they are admittedly abstract. And so I was trying to, think through some of these issues in my mind, because I was convinced that they are related. And they are. I mean, I'm still very convinced, but I just couldn't quite pull the post together to put it out on Substack. So I was like, you know what? Um, rather than taking forever and just writing this grandiose piece that's going to take forever for me to pull together, I'll just piecemeal it, or I'll write it as a series, or maybe even if it's not like a super formalized series, I'll just kind of put it out here and there as I write it, and take some of these otherwise nebulous concepts, and as I can kind of get them to firm up in my mind, I'll write about it and put it out like that. So I did. So I kind of wrote an initial stab at some of this, where I wanted to talk about war, but not in the way in which we typically think about it, but more as a phenomenon. So studying war as a phenomenon, or in other words, the phenomenology of war, um, but then looking at it as a deep concept. Okay, so let's unpack that real quick. So war is a phenomenon. Well, what does that mean, right? Um, I spent 40 years at the academy and 19 years in the military, and I thought I spent a lot of time studying war, but in reality, so I did study war, but the majority of the time what I was studying was warfare. Clearly, those two concepts are very related. They are not synonymous, however. War is the more fundamental concept, or the more fundamental theme. Warfare is derived from war. So if war is, simply stated, armed conflict, right? Then warfare would be the way or the methods in which you carry out that armed conflict. So in that regard, again, and we're being overly simplistic here, but that's okay for what we're just trying to do. Um, War is a what, and warfare is a how. Okay, so let's just kind of think about it like that. So war, when you get, so strip away the political objectives or your strategic ends, or the ways in which you're going to achieve those strategic ends. So strip all that away and just think about, okay, well, what is war and why war? Let's look at it as a phenomenon. All right, now hold that thought. All right. So I said that I was thinking about this concept that is related to war as a phenomenon that I call deep war. Well, what's deep war? So, we've all heard terms, especially the last couple of years or whatever, like the deep state or deep politics. In a military setting, if you look at the, so when I went to the School of Advanced Military Studies, and you talk a lot about kind of the evolution of modern warfare, right? And the one thing you study truly in depth at the School of Advanced Military Studies is what is called operational art, or the advent of the operational level of war. So generally speaking, most people would tell you there are 3 levels of war. There's the strategic level, the operational level, and the tactical level. Historically speaking, most people would only talk in terms of strategy and tactics. And then somewhere over the last, 100 years, 150 years, depending on who you ask, some might even say 200 years, you had the advent of this new level of war that kind of bridged strategy to tactics. And that became known as the operational level of war. And, you're going to get different military historians who are going to talk about when you started to see, operational art, or kind of the planning and the conduct of war at this middle tier, this operational level. So did it start with Napoleon? Did it kind of start in the American, you know, the American Civil War? I paused there because I don't even like using the term Civil War, because it's not a civil war. It's a weaponized term. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Or did it occur later than that, closer to the early 20th century? So again, this lies far outside the scope of this discussion, but what is important when it comes to the operational level of warfare was the ways in which maneuver warfare did evolve over time. And the Germans were certainly instrumental in that, and so were the Russians, and then later the Soviets. So there were some Soviet generals in the early days of the Soviet Union. They came up with these concepts that were known as deep battle, and then also in a more comprehensive view, deep operations. Okay, extremely simply stated, because again, this lies outside the scope of what we're really talking about. But deep battle would be a deviation away from kind of positional warfare, and instead looking at engaging your enemy, finding points of weakness in the front lines of your enemy, and then penetrating through with successive lines of units behind you. So it requires an enormous number of troops so that you can punch through, penetrate the enemy's front lines, and then move further into or deeper into your enemy's area to cut off their logistics lines or their command nodes or whatever. So instead of seeking positional victory, where kind of the two front lines meet, you are deliberately penetrating as deep as you can into your enemy's lines to exploit that initial penetration and cause a more significant, enduring loss for your enemy. Okay, so that would be deep battle. If you plan a series of those in an organized fashion, then it would be, a deep operation, etc. And this was extremely important not just as part of the evolution of maneuver warfare, but then also kind of in the recognition and kind of the solidified view of this operational level of warfare between strategy and tactics. Okay, great. So you look at that term in war or warfare, deep battle or deep operations. And then you look at the other use of the term that I mentioned, with deep politics or deep state. So in the West, the person who popularized the term the deep state was Professor Peter Dale Scott, who's written, quite a few books. A couple of them I have. A couple of them are actually right next to me on the floor right here. One of them is called The Road to 9/11, which I believe was published in 2007, which is where he first used the term deep state. But he took that term from the Turks, who used that term to kind of explain their own system, in which you have almost like a dual state, in which you have kind of this exterior that everyone sees, which is your constitutional legal state, right? Whether it's here or whether it's in whatever other country, right? But let's just talk about it in terms of the United States, even though the term came from Turkey. But you have what we believe of as our government created by the Constitution, but then you have so that's kind of your exoteric state that everyone sees, you're supposed to see. It's supposed to follow the Constitution, right? But the reason it doesn't is because you have this like inner core, which is much deeper within, which is not legal, cares nothing about the Constitution, and that's your deep state. Actually, I have right here, right next to me, I have this book, 1984, right? So in 1984 parlance, that would be your outer party and your inner party. Now, in the government of Oceania in George Orwell's 1984, the inner party is like it's official, it's institutionalized. In our deep state system, it's not official, it's not legal, but everyone just kind of understands that it exists. That's why you have a uniparty system, etc. Okay, great. What does that have to do with deep war? Because the connection here is just I'm just explaining why I use the term deep. I'm not drawing some connection between the deep state and deep war explicitly. There are some indirect connections. So we all understand when you hear deep state or deep politics. I mean, the metaphor is extremely apparent. You can almost look at it in terms of there's the surface of the sea and there are the waves that come crashing in, but there's a whole enormous volume of water that is very, very deep down that you can't necessarily see, but of course it's there. And that's the bulk of the sea that you are looking at, even if you can only see the surface, right? With deep battle, it's less kind of metaphorical, because you are like penetrating deep behind your enemy's front lines. But as I was thinking about this, for whatever reason, I was thinking about war as a phenomenon, and I just kind of started to think about it in terms of deep war and deep warfare. So mostly as a metaphor, right? So in some ways, it's a metaphorical usage of the term, like deep state or deep politics. However, it's not entirely metaphorical. So in some ways, it is kind of like the usage for deep battle or deep operations, because it's not totally metaphorical, but it is kind of esoteric. And esoteric and metaphorical are not the same thing. And this is where it gets super weird. This is why this stuff is kind of hard to write. So even as I am verbalizing this to you, I'm very much verbalizing to myself these concepts that I have in a very abstract form in my head, that by verbalizing them or by writing them on a Substack post, I'm trying to take these these thoughts that exist in Jello and then put them together in some sort of coherent train of logic, or with some sort of coherent train of logic. So you have war. We tend to think of war in physically kinetic terms. Okay, so again, strip out the politics and the strategy and just think about the way in which you are going to engage an enemy directly, and you are going to cause that enemy physical bodily harm. Okay, but there are other types of warfare that are also used. I mean, I talk a lot about war against the mind, war against the psyche. So those would be deeper than war against the body. And and this is where, like, kind of the, I'm saying war because we're also used to saying war, but I probably actually mean warfare. These are kind of like methods that are being used to engage the body physically, or the mind, or the psyche. So if the mind and or the psyche are deeper than the physical body, what's even deeper? What's kind of behind or more fundamental than what's kind of one step further than the mind or the psyche? Well, it would be the spirit. So we're talking about spirit warfare, not spirit war, although that's also very important. But there's kind of this concept of spirit war and spirit warfare. So if you are directly engaged in techniques or tactics in a way in which certain methods of engagement are targeted towards the spirit of an individual or individuals, then that is spirit warfare, which can be part of a much larger kind of spirit war. So why is war so prevalent in the world? Oh, we live in a fallen world, and people are, looking to gain advantages over other people, and sometimes, you know, wars occur. Okay, I mean, I got it. I understand that, but let's get past all that. Let's step outside the dialectic and realize that a lot of wars are orchestrated by elite networks of powerful people. Elite networks of powerful people, very evil people who control a lot of assets, and they control a lot of governments and, the intel agencies, which I think to some degree are just one big secret society. They orchestrate both sides, and then they cause, they push both sides together, and they cause these massive wars to occur, and it's all orchestrated. Not in every case, but I'm saying a lot of the large wars, that's how it happens. I mean, I think that's how World War I was orchestrated. That's how World War II was orchestrated. I mean, there's a lot more to that, but I mean, I do believe that they were largely orchestrated. Is World War III about ready to happen? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't predict the future, but what I can tell you is, if a massive war were going to occur, the indicators that we would see ahead of time would probably look a lot like what we are observing right now. Does that mean World War III is upon us? I'm not necessarily saying that. I am saying the situation does not look good. I am saying that. So, but these powerful networks of people that I believe are, influenced, by evil. You can interpret that however you want. I mean, do I believe that at the very top, some of these individuals are influenced by demonic entities? Yeah, probably. Yeah, I do. But whatever. What are they trying to gain through war? So again, strip out the fact that they're using war in order to destroy national sovereignty and destroy national governments or certain empires. If we look at World War I, like, how many large empires were destroyed in World War I? The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire. I mean, I think even the Germans were an empire in World War I, right? So these because I feel like the German flag for World War One is not the current German flag. Anyway, so the what was what was being accomplished? I mean, not just, wars against empires. My point in sharing that is, certainly there are geopolitical objectives that even these powerful networks that control the world are trying to achieve through massive war. I totally understand that. But is there something more fundamental? Is there something metaphysical that is achieved through war? And I mean, I'm asking an open-ended question. I mean, I do believe there is, but I'm not here to tell you exactly, how that works. I mean, I'm hypothesizing, but I do believe there is. So when we talk about being in a spiritual war, which I think we are, and I think many of us intuitively know that, right? And if you come from if your worldview is a Christian worldview, then you may even use those terms when you talk. I do. But many of us, when we use those terms, we use them incorrectly, or we use that terminology incompletely. I myself have been guilty of this, often. And we speak of ourselves being in a spiritual war, or we talk about spiritual warfare, and we use it as a metaphor. And I think that's incorrect. It's not a metaphor. Just because it's not physically kinetic, at least not always, or maybe it's, invisible. Its effects may be sometimes intangible. That doesn't mean that it is therefore it can only be spoken about in metaphorical ways. No, that's not true at all. It just means that sometimes things that are very real manifest themselves in ways that are not necessarily, physically visible. In fact, the war is spiritual, like the war of all wars, the ultimate war that we're all engaged in. These physically kinetic wars that we see are just, physical expressions of the spiritual war that we're in, or at least to a large degree. Because I think right now what's happening is it's not so much a lot of these wars, and again, not every case, but a lot of these wars that are orchestrated dialectically, it's not nation A versus nation B. That's the way it looks. That's not actually what's going on. That is powerful people that are extremely evil, that are orchestrating both sides and making the people from nation A fight the people from nation B, when in reality, the people from nation A and the people from nation B are victims who are each being victimized by their own governments, who are controlled by these networks of extremely evil people. And if the people from nation A and nation B would stop looking at each other and fighting and kind of look upward towards their own governments, and then those who control their governments, they would realize, who their true enemy is. So a lot of these, what we see of as wars, are just those are certain expressions of the overall spiritual war that are being conducted in a physically kinetic modality through tanks, bombs, operational maneuvers, by placing units here or there, et cetera, right? Pieces of land being taken, and then negotiations being waged and treaties being signed, et cetera. Again, I understand all of that. I'm not saying that's not a crucial part of war. I'm trying to get past that and speak about something that is more fundamental. So why would evil want war? Oh, because a lot of people get killed. Well, yeah, okay, but let's go past that, right? In occult rituals, we know, and I do not pretend to know a lot about this. I don't run around in those circles. But I do believe it's important for us to know our enemy, and I do believe that our enemies do engage in a lot of that stuff. And I mean, there are blood sacrifices. Do I believe that these people look at war as a large ritual. Yeah, I mean, I think they do. I mean, I think they look at that. They look at the energy that is released through the engagement in war. And again, I'm not talking about the energy that is released in a physically kinetic way, in which destruction is carried out against a unit, or carried out against even a civilian population, or a city that is destroyed. That destruction is very real and very sad. That's not even necessarily what I'm referring to, though. I'm referring to what other types of energy, dark energy, are released when war happens. And again, these are questions. I mean, I'm theorizing, and I'm supposing, but I'm asking open-ended questions, right? So, let me know what you think in the comments. But I mean, I'm not the first person to ask about the spirituality of war. I think people have been talking about this for a while. But I also think people talk about it, myself included, often in a superficial way. And I'm trying to get much more fundamental, and kind of, that's why I talk about the phenomenology of war and looking at it as a deep concept. Okay. So what's the deepness, or the depth of what I'm talking about? I think the deep war is, again, kind of understanding the vastness of the spiritual war that we are all in. This is the war, the war of all wars, the ultimate war that has cosmic implications, right? That and to some degree, if you come from a Christian worldview like I do, then God very much understands that. I mean, that's a crucial reason as to why the atonement of Christ occurred. I mean, we already believe that we're in a spiritual war. What I'm trying to do is, within that framework, understand kind of, well, what does that mean for us as we're here trying to kind of meander our way through this, right? So there's kind of that depth to the war, as it goes so far beyond just what we see on the surface, right? But then there's another aspect of depth to it. And this is kind of, you have deep war and then deep warfare. And this goes back to what I was talking about before. There's warfare against the body, like, I mean, if you're a soldier and you aim your M4 at an enemy soldier, okay, that's warfare against the body. Or you can engage in other types of techniques psychologically. That's war against the psyche, or war against the mind. But if you go deeper, and I keep saying war when I probably mean warfare, right? You see how this gets kind of tricky? Because we're kind of talking about like methods and almost modalities through which this is conducted. And so that's kind of the aspect of deep warfare. And if it sounds like I'm just like saying a lot of words without making sense, it's probably because I'm all over the place, but also because these are admittedly abstract concepts that I am trying to solidify in some way. So my overall point here is I believe that these people who are trying to control the world, and to a large degree do, I mean, they pretty much run, I think, virtually all the governments in the world. I mean, we saw that during the whole, the last op that the whole world's been through for the last 3.5 years, nearly 4 years now. And all the governments went along. So, when you look at occult rituals, and again, I don't pretend to be an expert on this at all, but I do know that in the occult rituals that these people are very fond of, because this is their worldview, at the top, our enemies, they are not atheists. No, they know. They know. Atheism is I assume that they view atheism as a trick for the uninitiated. I think at the top, those who were warring against, no, they have a very different view of theology and where they have chosen to align themselves. But they are not atheists. They are not rank materialists. They know that there's much more to our cosmology than just, the material world. And I think they try to tap into that. And if you there's another Substack, and I mean I write about this in multiple Substacks, but one of the Substacks in which I talk about this is the one where I mention Dark Ritual. And I'll link that below, along with the Deep War Substack that I wrote recently. But they are looking for ways in which they release dark energy, because I believe I know how this sounds. But I mean, I think this is what's going on. So you have demonic entities out there that feed off of negative energy. And I think a lot of negative energy is released during war. Now, to some degree, that's kind of like, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, right? But I'm trying to get past just the yeah, obviously. I'm trying to get deeper into this concept, So like, if blood is used in occult rituals, well, what else is used in occult rituals? Well, I mean, sex is used in occult rituals. So think about the way in which procreative energies, which of course, ultimately come from God, are co-opted and inverted by very evil people for, dark purposes. So I think these people know how to try and manipulate the energy of life, whether it's kind of procreation, or at least the energies that come from or the energies through which, procreation is achieved, right? Which are some of the most profound potentialities that God has imbued within man, right? But also think about the other end of the spectrum of life. So like the taking of life. I mean, like blood sacrifices, we know that stuff occurs. So what if it occurs on a mass scale? And what if the victims are doing it to each other for a large orchestrated purpose? And in war, you have sometimes very good people, otherwise innocent people, who are in terrible situations in which they must do terrible things. And I'm not necessarily attributing guilt to that. Like, that's not necessarily my point. I mean, I'm talking about soldiers who really feel, and to some degree may actually be defending their families, defending their homelands, etc., because they're in this situation that on a macro level has been orchestrated to put them in. But now you have good people who are not just subjected to terrible things, but to some degree are carrying out terrible things. I'm not talking about atrocities. I'm not talking about war crimes. I'm talking about even very good people, honorable soldiers of whatever nation, who are, forced to carry out violence against other human beings in what would be even just a lawful conduct of war, or a noble conduct of war. I mean, it's still terrible, and I'm not particularly squeamish. So I believe that, because I believe that a lot of these wars are orchestrated, I think that they, shouldn't happen. That doesn't mean that I am a super pacifist that believes war should never occur. No, I believe war should be a last resort. I don't believe that war is never necessary, but I do kind of believe that it's rarely necessary. And that when it is waged, a lot of times it's waged against the wrong enemy. But a lot of people don't necessarily know that. They find themselves in situations where they have to engage in war. I understand that. But I'm not particularly squeamish about um what has to happen during war when a war is just. And um yeah, it's gonna happen. And when I say that, what I mean is like, um somebody comes into my house in the middle of the night, I fully intend on protecting myself to whatever extent I need to protect myself. And I have the means to do that. And while I hope it never comes to that, um, I don't necessarily feel that if it comes to that, it comes to that, right? I'm not particularly squeamish about people who put themselves into situations where they then die. And so when a war is just and people have brought that against themselves, I'm not necessarily super squeamish about that, right? Um, I do not like innocent people dying because they are the victims of evil people. I'm more talking about, when evil people put themselves into situations in which, you know, they die. I'm not particularly squeamish about that. I probably didn't explain any of that very well, but my point is that, again, I was in the army for a long time. I think war should be shunned as much as possible. I do not believe that war should be glorified. However, um, I do believe that being a soldier is a noble profession. I do believe that defense of the homeland, like true, just defense of the homeland, can be glorified. I believe that heroic conduct in battle can be glorified. I believe there can even be um a almost like a there is almost kind of like a spiritual ethos that can go with the culture of battle, or the warrior ethos. That I believe that can be noble. What I'm talking about is kind of the inversion of all that, or maybe the inversion, but then also looking at evil people who take that and kind of co-opt that in such a way so as to release negative energy that they then feed on. Anyway, so deep war, deep warfare. Those are just some thoughts that I probably did not explain very well at all. Um, I do think there's something to that. I do think that these very powerful yet extremely diabolical people who are the true enemies of, all of us, right? I do believe that they want war, and they want war for very specific reasons, and it goes beyond just the bloodshed or the carnage. In other words, the bloodshed and the carnage is not just to it's not just a means to achieve some end, which may be, forming the geopolitical order in the way that they want it to be formed in order to move forward for whatever they have designed. So in that regard, it's not just a means to an end. I believe that they see war as a phenomenon, as an end unto itself, but not just a physically destructive end, but that there is a huge spiritual component that is much deeper, but just as real. So again, I don't know if any of that made sense. But yeah, deep war, deep warfare. Yeah, it took me, I was trying to, so I wanted to link this with kind of like what's going on in the Middle East right now. I was going to kind of talk about dialectics. I was going to talk about the nature of truth. I had all this stuff that I was trying to tie together, and it was too much. And so I was like, you know what? I gotta scope this down. What I was trying to write was just too aspirational. I got to scope this down and kind of figure out this more abstract part of it, then I can kind of link it as we go to some of the other stuff. So to some of those other themes. So anyway, yeah, I wanted to throw this at you. Maybe you'll find this interesting. I will link my Substack in which I first started talking about the phenomenology of war, which I wrote about 10 days ago, or maybe not quite that long ago, maybe a week ago, where I kind of introduced this concept of deep war, what I was thinking when I wrote that, and then I'll throw in the link to the Substack about dark ritual as well. But anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. Hopefully some of this rambling at least made some semblance of sense to you. All right. Have a good evening.